My husband begged me for nearly $2 million to save his dying mom. You are her only hope, his word. Hi, welcome to Family Revenge. I'd like to work to you thought a new story today.
The moment I was about to transfer nearly $2 million to save my gravely ill mother-in-law who urgently needed a kidney transplant, my husband held my hand, his voice trembling. You're her only hope. But he didn't know I had already uncovered everything: the shell companies, the siphoned money, and the woman wearing the scarf I once bought for him. He thought his plan was perfect. And that was the exact moment I began turning his life into an inescapable trap. I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me what country or city are you watching from. I'd love to know where this story is reaching. A quick note: this story includes fictional elements woven in for entertainment and educational purposes. Any similarity to names or places is coincidental, but the lesson inside it is something worth keeping. The hospital cafeteria on the first floor of Vanderbilt University Medical Center smells the same at 7 in the morning as it does at midnight: burned coffee, industrial cleaner, and something underneath both of those things that I can only describe as waiting. That particular smell had soaked into my clothes over the past 3 days. I had stopped noticing it somewhere around Tuesday afternoon, which is the same time I stopped noticing how tired I was. I was sitting at a corner table near the window when Conrad came through the double doors. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. Not from the cafeteria line, but from the good cart on the second floor, the one that required taking an elevator and waiting in a line that was never short. He had done that at 7 in the morning after being awake most of the night. He set 1 cup in front of me with both hands. The way you set something down when you want the other person to understand it matters. She made it, Viv, he said, and his voice was soft in a way I had not heard in years. He sat down across from me and reached for my hand. Because of you. I looked at him. His face was open, relieved, the particular kind of relief that you cannot fake. The kind that lives in the way a person's shoulders finally drop after holding something heavy for too long. He looked like the man I had married 31 years ago, sitting across a small table and meaning every word he said. I picked up the coffee and held it with both hands. It was the right temperature. He had thought about that. How are you holding up? I asked. Better now. He squeezed my hand once, then let go. You should eat something. I can get you one of those muffins you like, the blueberry ones from the cart. I'm fine. You haven't eaten since yesterday afternoon, Viv. Conrad. I said his name the way I always did when I wanted him to stop managing me. He smiled and leaned back. I watched him in the morning light coming through the cafeteria windows. The gray at his temples had gotten thicker in the past year. There were new lines at the corners of his eyes that I did not remember being there last spring. He looked tired in the way that successful men look tired, like exhaustion was just another appointment they had scheduled and moved through efficiently. He checked his phone. Not urgently, just a glance, but his eyes stayed on the screen a half-second longer than they would if there was nothing important there. I have a few calls to make, he said, sliding his chair back. He picked up his coffee and straightened his jacket with one hand, a habit so old I had stopped seeing it years ago. Rest here. I'll check back in before noon. He walked toward the doors without looking back. That was also a habit. Conrad had always moved through rooms as if the rooms were already behind him. I sat with my coffee and watched the cafeteria fill up around me. A group of residents in scrubs came through the doors, arguing about something I could not hear. A woman in a yellow coat sat down 2 tables over and opened a paper bag. An orderly pushed a cart past the window and disappeared around the corner. The ordinary machinery of a hospital morning, turning without anyone noticing. I thought about the first time Conrad had brought me coffee without being asked. We had been living in a 1-bedroom apartment in East Nashville, and I had been up since 4 in the morning working on a freight contract that I was terrified we were going to lose. He had come into the kitchen at 6, seen the papers spread across the table, and made a pot without saying a word. He had set a mug next to my hand and gone back to get ready for work. That was the morning I decided I was going to marry him, even though he had not asked yet. I held the cup from the second floor cart and thought about that morning, and then I thought about the way his eyes had looked just now, that particular quality behind the warmth, precise and patient. Like a door that has been closed and locked but is still pretending to be open. I had seen that look before, not often, but I knew it. 31 years of marriage had taught me one thing about Conrad Ashford. When he was kind without reason, when the coffee appeared and the voice went soft, and the hand reached across the table, he was never just being kind. The text message arrived while I was still holding the cup he had brought me from upstairs. 4 words from Conrad. Back by 2 o'clock. No explanation of where he had gone, who he was calling, what those calls required. Just a time and a destination. Written the way a lawyer writes things, only as much as is necessary, nothing more. I read it once and set the phone face down on the table. 9 months ago, I would have written back, fine or okay, or something equally small and automatic that kept the quiet machinery of our daily life turning without anyone having to think too hard about it. That was how a long marriage worked, not in large declarations, but in small exchanges that added up to a life you lived without examining too closely. 9 months ago, I also signed 14 documents without asking the one question that mattered. I remember the night. It was a March evening, cold the way Tennessee gets cold in March. Not the honest cold of January, but the kind that surprises you after a warm afternoon, that catches you somewhere between 2 seasons and leaves you underdressed. Conrad had come home later than usual and set a thick folder on my desk in the study. I was finishing a glass of wine, half watching something on the television in the corner and not thinking about anything in particular. He pulled a chair up beside me and opened the folder the way he always opened folders, efficiently without ceremony. Restructuring documents, he said. Estate planning, asset protection, some tax optimization we should have done 3 years ago. My accountant finally put everything together. I picked up the first page. It was the kind of legal language that lawyers write for other lawyers, dense with subparagraphs and cross-references and defined terms in capital letters. Whereas, and therefore, the kind of document that is designed, whether intentionally or not, to exhaust civilian attention before the reader reaches the parts that actually matter. Walk me through the main points, I said. He did. That was one of the things Conrad was genuinely good at, taking complicated structures and making them sound logical and inevitable, which was why clients had paid him extremely well for more than 2 decades. He explained that we were moving our jointly held assets into a more protected legal framework. The house in Brentwood, the shared investment accounts, the rental property in Germantown. All of it would sit inside a structure that offered better liability protection and more favorable tax treatment. A cleaner arrangement for the stage of life we were entering. It's standard, he said. Every attorney I know has done the same thing. I signed where the yellow tabs told me to sign. 14 times over the course of about 40 minutes, while Conrad refilled my wine glass once and responded to 2 emails on his phone. What I know now, sitting in this cafeteria with the morning light coming flat through the windows, is that I had a business degree from this very university and 17 years of running a company. And I still signed those papers without asking whose name each asset would be held in after the transfers were complete. I think about that often. I am not a careless person, or I was not before that March evening. I had spent 17 years reading contracts before signing them, questioning numbers that did not align, pushing back on terms that felt off. I knew what asset protection structures looked like from the outside. I had used them myself when I was building the logistics company that I eventually sold. But there is a particular kind of document that only works if the person signing it trusts the person handing it over. Conrad understood that. He had always understood exactly where the boundary was between my professional habit of caution and my personal faith in him. That March evening, he handed me something across that line, and I let him, because that is what 31 years of choosing someone every day does to a person's guard. The house in Brentwood, the joint investment accounts, the rental in Germantown. On paper, all of it now belonged to structures that carried Conrad's name. My phone buzzed against the table. Another message longer this time. Lawyers need one more signature this afternoon. Routine. I'll have the documents ready when I get back. I read it. Then I set the phone face down again without responding. There was nothing routine about any of it, and there never had been. I understood that now the way you understand something that was always true, not with shock, but with the quiet, leveling recognition of someone who has finally stopped looking slightly to the left of the answer. I thought about the party. 8 months ago, Conrad's firm had held its annual dinner at the Hermitage Hotel in downtown Nashville, a formal evening at a grand old building that had hosted presidents and society weddings and the kind of conversation that sounds important, but rarely is. I had been standing near the bar between one group and another when Marcus Weld appeared at my elbow. Marcus was Conrad's law partner of 24 years, a deliberate, precise man who won cases not by being the sharpest voice in the room, but by being the most thoroughly prepared. We had exchanged pleasantries at dozens of firm events over the years, but he had never sought me out specifically until that night. He leaned slightly toward me. His voice was low, careful, almost covered by the music. "Vivienne," he said. "Are you all right, really?" I told him yes. He looked at me for a moment longer than the question required, nodded once, and moved on. I had thought about that question every single day since. Marcus Weld's question had stayed with me the way certain questions do not, because they are unanswerable, but because answering them honestly requires more time than the moment allows. Are you all right? Really? I had been asking myself a version of that question for longer than I wanted to admit. And sitting in the cafeteria with Conrad's unanswered text on my phone and the morning moving forward without me, I found myself going back to the beginning. Not to find an excuse, and not to assign blame before I had finished understanding. Just to be fair. I had promised myself I would be fair about this even now. Conrad was not always the man he had become. That is the honest place to start. In October of 1994, we were living in a one-bedroom apartment in East Nashville that had 2 good windows, 1 unreliable radiator, and a parking situation that required a certain creativity and patience every evening. Conrad was 27 and working 80-hour weeks at a downtown firm, building the kind of resume that only gets built through sustained discomfort. I was 24 and had just taken out a small business loan to start a freight logistics operation out of a rented desk at a shared office on Gallatin Road. We ate cold pizza more often than either of us would have admitted to our parents. We argued about small things and agreed about large ones. We believed in each other with a completeness that I have not found words for since. Those early years had a particular texture. We were both building something and both knew it. And that shared understanding made the long hours and the tight budgets feel temporary rather than permanent. We talked about the work, his cases, my contracts, the small victories that felt enormous and the setbacks that felt unsurvivable until they weren't. He would ask about my clients by name and remember the details. I would read the briefs he brought home and tell him what I thought. We were in each other's professional lives the way people are when they are genuinely interested and not just performing interest. I am not sure exactly when that changed. That is the honest answer. It was not one moment, but a long series of small ones spread across enough years that no single point stands out as the turning. What I can say is that somewhere around the time my company started growing in ways that surprised both of us, Conrad stopped asking about it. Not abruptly, he was too careful for abrupt. But the questions came less often, and when they came, they were shorter. Polite rather than curious. The difference between someone who wants to know and someone who has decided that knowing is no longer necessary. There were no arguments about it. That was the thing. I would have preferred arguments. Arguments meant the gap between two people was still close enough to fight across. What we had instead was a gradual widening that neither of us named out loud, and that I spent several years telling myself was simply the natural evolution of a marriage between two busy people. By 2019, The logistics company I had started on a borrowed desk was operating contracts across 11 states and turning a number that I had once written on a napkin as a joke about what success might look like someday. In the fall of 2021, I accepted an acquisition offer. The total sale was $28 million. My share of the proceeds after accounting for our other partners, the employee equity pool, capital gains taxes, and various transaction costs, came to $1.9 million. I kept it separate, under Tennessee law money that belongs to one spouse individually, money earned from a business that person built. Held in an account that carries only that person's name is classified as separate property. It does not become part of the marital estate automatically. I had known this for years in a general way, the way people who have built businesses know the outlines of the legal structures around them. After the sale, I moved the money into a personal investment account in my name only, not out of any suspicion, but out of the same instinct that had made me a good business person. You keep things organized. You keep things clear. You keep what is yours in a place where it cannot accidentally become something else. Conrad's reaction that night was 4 words. "That's your money, Viv." He said it warmly with a small nod as if he were acknowledging something I had worked hard for and properly deserved. I thought it was respect. I thought it was a man recognizing his wife's independence and honoring it. I poured us both a glass of wine and we sat in the kitchen and talked about what I might do with it eventually. And it was one of the better evenings we had shared in some time. I understand now what those 4 words actually were. Not generosity, not respect. A man noting the location of something he intended to come back for later when the conditions were right. The receipt was from a winter evening roughly 18 months before all of this. I found it in the inside pocket of Conrad's blazer when I was taking things to the dry cleaner. A restaurant on Woodland Street, a small Italian place I had driven past but never been inside. Table for 2. 9 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. The total was the kind of total you ran up over a long dinner with good wine. Conrad had told me he was in Memphis that Tuesday. A client dinner, he had said. Back Thursday morning. I stood in the kitchen for a long time holding that small piece of paper. The house was quiet around me. I could hear the refrigerator running and a car passing on the street outside, and nothing else. I was deciding what kind of woman I wanted to be. The decision I made that night in the kitchen, standing with that receipt from a restaurant I had never been to. Processing the fact that my husband had lied to me about where he was on a Tuesday evening was not the dramatic, immediate kind of decision that makes sense in a story. It was quieter than that. I put the receipt back in the pocket of the blazer. I took the blazer to the dry cleaner the next morning. I did not say anything to Conrad, and I became, over the following months, a woman who paid very close attention. That was 13 months ago. On a Thursday night in July at 11:40 in the evening, I was sitting at my desk in the upstairs study with a glass of water I had not touched, and a laptop screen that was the only light in the room. Conrad was asleep down the hall. The house was completely quiet. I had come up to look at something specific and I had found something else entirely. I built a logistics company from a spreadsheet and a borrowed desk. I know what numbers are supposed to do, the direction they are supposed to flow, the accounts they are supposed to move between, the logic that connects one figure to the next. When a number is out of place, I feel it before I can explain it, the way a musician hears a wrong note before they can name which one it is. I had opened a digital copy of one of the restructuring documents I signed the previous March. Not to review the whole thing I had accepted by then, that the details were arranged in a way that would take a professional some time to properly untangle. I was looking at one specific section, one specific line item, trying to match it to a statement I had received from our joint investment account. The numbers did not match. A transfer of $340,000 had moved from our joint account to an entity listed as Crestline Medical Billing LLC. That name was not anywhere in the documents Conrad had walked me through. It was not a name I recognized from any conversation we had ever had about our finances. It was simply there. embedded in the middle of a page of routine-looking transactions, the way something foreign sits in a landscape, noticeable only if you are already looking. I searched for Crestline Medical Billing LLC. What I found was this: a limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware 14 months prior. Delaware is a common choice for businesses that want privacy. The state requires very little public disclosure when registering a company, which is entirely legal and frequently used by legitimate businesses for legitimate reasons. What made this particular registration different was what it lacked. There was no website, no listed phone number, no verifiable physical address. The registered agent was a name I had never heard. The mailing address on file was a suite number in Nashville, Tennessee. I recognized that suite number. It was the address of Ashford and Weld LLP, Conrad's firm. The same building where Conrad had worked for 24 years, where his name was on the door in brushed metal letters, where he kept an office on the 11th floor with a view of the Cumberland River. I sat with that for a long moment. Using a law firm's address to register an outside business entity without the knowledge and consent of the other partners was not a small administrative oversight. In the legal profession, it crossed into territory that the American Bar Association's rules of professional conduct treated with considerable seriousness. It was the kind of thing that, if discovered by the wrong person at the wrong time, could unravel a legal career in ways that were very difficult to recover from. Conrad knew that better than anyone, which meant he had done it anyway, and believed he could manage the exposure. Which meant whatever this company was connected to was important enough to him to accept that risk. I did not call Conrad. Confronting him at this stage would have accomplished one thing: he would have known I was looking. A man who had been careful enough to do what I was looking at would not leave loose ends visible from the front. He would simply move them somewhere else, somewhere I could not see, and I would lose whatever small advantage I currently had. I opened my desk drawer. At the back, behind a collection of things I kept meaning to organize, was a business card I had been given at a Nashville Bar Association event the previous fall. A woman I had known professionally for several years had pressed it into my hand after a conversation about a contract dispute I had been having, not as a formal referral, but as someone she trusted to be thorough and quiet. Philip Novak, Private Financial Investigations, former Special Agent, FBI Financial Crimes Unit. I looked at the card for a moment. It was plain white, simple type, a Nashville area code. Nothing on it suggested what it had cost other people to find him useful. I picked up my phone. It was nearly midnight. I dialed anyway. He answered on the third ring, sounding entirely awake, which told me something about the kind of work he did and the hours it kept. I gave him my name and told him I had a financial situation I needed looked at by someone who understood how money moved when people did not want it to be tracked. I gave him enough to establish that I was serious, and not nearly enough to tip my hand. "I'll review what you've described," he said. "I'll call you in a few days." He called 3 days later. "Mrs. Hartley," he said. His voice had a quality to it that I had not heard on the first call, careful, measured. The way a person sounds when they have found something and are choosing how to hand it over. "We need to meet in person, not over the phone." I had known from the moment I found Crestline Medical Billing LLC that whatever I was looking at was larger than a single misplaced transfer. Philip's tone confirmed that what he had found was larger still. Frothy Monkey on Charlotte Avenue was the kind of place that Nashville had built its neighborhood identity around: worn wooden floors, mismatched chairs, the smell of espresso ground fresh every few minutes, a particular quality of morning light that came through the front windows and fell across the tables in long yellow strips. On a Monday in early August, it was full of the usual mix of graduate students, freelancers, and people who worked from wherever they happened to be sitting. Nobody paid attention to two people having a quiet conversation in the back corner. That was why I had suggested it. Philip Novak was already at the table when I arrived 8 minutes before we were supposed to meet, with a black coffee in front of him and nothing else. He was in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, the kind of man whose face did not give much away without his permission. He did not look like someone who had spent the better part of 20 years tracking financial fraud for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He looked like someone who repaired antique clocks patient precise in no hurry whatsoever. He stood when I reached the table, shook my hand once, and sat back down. No small talk. 4 companies, he said, not one. He turned a folder toward me. Inside were printouts, each one a registration document for a different limited liability company. A shell company. The term refers to a legal entity that exists on paper but has no genuine operations, no employees, no real product or service, is not inherently illegal. Businesses use them for all kinds of legitimate purposes, holding real estate, managing liability, organizing investments across different categories. What makes a shell company something else entirely is what gets moved through it and where that money goes afterward. The 4 companies Philip had identified all shared 2 things. The first was that they had been registered in Delaware at intervals spread across the previous 14 months. The second was that their listed business address in Nashville was a suite on the 11th floor of a building on Commerce Street downtown, the same suite that housed the offices of Ashford and Weld LLP. The managing partner of a law firm cannot register private business entities using the firm's address without the consent of the other named partners, Philip said. It is a violation of the firm's operating agreement, and depending on how those entities are used, it can constitute a breach of fiduciary duty under Tennessee partnership law. It also implicates several provisions of the American Bar Association's professional conduct rules. I looked at the pages. Crestline Medical Billing LLC was listed second. The others had names that sounded equally benign and equally meaningless. How much has moved through them? From your jointly held accounts, approximately $840,000 over the 14 months. That is what I can document from the records currently available to me. He paused. The number is likely higher. He closed the folder and looked at me directly. Mrs. Hartley, I want to ask you something about a separate account. A personal investment account held in your name only. I told him about the $1.9 million the proceeds from the company sale kept separate in my name alone. He nodded as if he had already known, which I suspected he had. Under Tennessee law, that money is your separate property, he said. Your husband cannot transfer it, encumber it, or access it without your direct and voluntary participation. It is legally insulated from the marital estate. He set his coffee down. Which means that if someone wanted access to it, they would need to find a reason for you to hand it over yourself. The morning moved around us. Someone ordered something at the counter with a great deal of specificity. A door opened and let in a brief rush of August heat. What kind of reason? I asked. In my experience, Philip said, the mechanism is almost always medical. Someone close to the target will require something urgent and expensive, a procedure, a treatment, a situation that has no apparent alternative. The emotional pressure is designed to be total. You cannot say no because saying no means someone you care about suffers the consequence. He turned his coffee cup once on the table. The target pays willingly, gratefully even, and by the time the full picture becomes clear, the money is already gone. I sat with that for a moment. You're telling me this is already in motion? I'm telling you the structure is in place, and the account has been identified. He looked at me evenly. Whether the rest follows depends on variables I don't yet have visibility into. He reached into the folder and removed a single photograph. He set it face up on the table and turned it toward me without comment. A young woman, dark hair pulled back. She was walking out through a set of automatic glass doors that I recognized, the outpatient entrance to Vanderbilt's nephrology clinic, the department that handled kidney disease and renal conditions. The timestamp in the corner read a Thursday morning in late July. She was wearing a coat against the air conditioning, and around her neck, loose and casual, was a dark green silk scarf. I recognized the scarf. I had bought it at a shop in the Gulch 4 Christmases ago, a deliberate choice, a particular shade of green that I had thought would suit him. Conrad had worn it twice, and then told me, sometime the following spring, that he had left it on an airplane. He was sorry. These things happened. I looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. Who is she? I asked. That Philip said is what I'm still working on. Philip's office was on the third floor of a building on West End Avenue in Midtown Nashville, 2 blocks from the Vanderbilt campus. It was a spare room, a desk, 2 chairs, a window that looked out over a parking structure, and along one wall a series of filing cabinets that were the most organized things I had seen in a long time. He had cleared space on the desk when I arrived and laid the materials out in a sequence that told me he had thought carefully about the order in which to present them. He let me sit down before he started. Her real name is Delaney Frost, he said. She is 33 years old. She has been employed as a legal assistant at Ashford and Weld LLP for the past 4 years. He set a photograph on the desk beside the folder. It was a clearer image than the one from the cafe, a staff photograph, formal background professional. The woman in it was young and thin in the way that serious illness makes a person thin. She had the same dark hair, the same face I had seen walking out of the nephrology clinic 3 days ago. Without the coat, without the scarf, she looked more fragile than she had from a distance. She has been receiving treatment at Vanderbilt for end-stage renal disease for the past 11 months. Philip continued. End-stage renal disease, he explained briefly, meant that her kidneys had lost nearly all functional capacity, the point at which dialysis keeps a person alive, but transplantation becomes the only real path forward. She had been on the waiting list. A match had recently been found. She is currently admitted to the 4th floor of Vanderbilt under the name Dana Forbes. I looked at the name on the intake document he slid toward me. Dana Forbes. A clean, ordinary name that belonged to no one. Conrad arranged the admission under the false identity, Philip said. He told her that filing under her real name would give her insurance provider grounds to reclassify the transplant as a procedure related to a pre-existing condition and deny the claim. He paused. That is not an accurate description of how insurance law works in this country. Under the Affordable Care Act, insurers cannot deny coverage or increase premiums based on pre-existing conditions for individual or employer-sponsored plans. It has not been legal to do so since 2014. But she believed him. She believed him, Philip confirmed. She was 33 years old, in the final stage of kidney failure, dependent on dialysis 3 times a week, and in a relationship with the man who was telling her this. She was also, by all indications, being carefully isolated from outside perspectives during the months leading up to the admission. He set his pen down. People in that condition believe what they need to believe. Conrad understood that. He is very good at identifying the precise point where fear makes a person stop asking questions. I sat with that for a moment. The particular cruelty of it, not the deception itself, but the targeting of it. He had found the place where she was most afraid and built his instructions directly on top of that fear so that following his directions and surviving felt like the same thing. My phone rang. I did not recognize the number immediately, but I picked up because Philip's expression did not change, and I had learned in the past 3 days that interruptions at this particular juncture were not coincidental. It was Donna Reeves. Donna had been my closest friend for nearly 16 years. We had met through mutual contact in the Nashville business community when I was still building the logistics company and she was finishing her residency in clinical pharmacy. She was now the chief pharmacist at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, which meant she oversaw the medication management systems for the entire hospital, including the database that tracked every prescription filled, every refill requested, and every drug interaction flagged for every patient in the system going back years. In her professional role, she had access to prescription histories that were ordinarily private access she used carefully, within the bounds of what her position permitted, to verify medications and catch errors before they reached patients. She had, at my request 2 weeks earlier, agreed to look at something specific. "Viv," she said. Her voice was careful. "I pulled the prescription history on Loretta Ashford. 3 years going back as far as the system has records." A pause. "There is not a single kidney medication in there. No immunosuppressants, no phosphate binders, no erythropoiesis, stimulating agents, nothing that would appear in the profile of a patient with renal disease at any stage. No kidney function panels ordered, no nephrology referrals documented. I said nothing. Whoever told anyone that woman has a kidney condition, Donna said quietly, is lying. I thanked her and ended the call. I looked at the photograph of Delaney Frost on Philip's desk. I thought about Loretta Ashford Conrad's mother, 79 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Franklin, Tennessee, a woman I had brought birthday cakes to and sat beside at family dinners for 31 years. A woman who was apparently in excellent renal health. I thought about the green silk scarf in the photograph from the clinic. I had bought it at a small shop in the Gulch in December, chosen the color carefully, wrapped it myself. Conrad had worn it exactly twice before telling me it was gone. The scarf was not gone. It was around the neck of the woman Conrad intended my money to save, the woman whose transplant would be funded by a transfer I had not yet made, but that every structure Conrad had built over the past 14 months was designed to produce. The kidney was not for his mother. It had never been for his mother. Loretta Ashford was not sick. She was available. The two pieces fit together with a precision that left no room for alternative explanations. Philip was already reaching for his pen when I looked up. Conrad filed the transplant authorization paperwork at Vanderbilt this morning, he said. A donor match has been confirmed. The surgical team is discussing a window of approximately 3 weeks. 3 weeks. I looked at him across the desk, across the organized documents and the clear photographs and the careful sequence of information he had laid out for me. 3 weeks was not a long time, but it was the time I had, and I had never in my life failed to work with what was in front of me. Vivian had 3 weeks and a plan no one saw coming. Before I take you inside it, type "still here" in the comments. I read every single one. And right now, I want to know exactly how many of you are riding this out to the end. Some elements in this story are fictional, built with purpose. If you'd prefer something different, there's no judgment in stepping away now. By the following Monday, I had not slept more than 5 consecutive hours on any given night, and I had learned more about the architecture of financial deception than I had ever expected to need. One Nashville Place rises 21 floors above the intersection of Commerce and 4th Avenue in downtown Nashville. Close enough to the courthouse that the legal community had settled into its upper floors over the years, the way water settles into low ground. Nora Fenn's office was on the 12th floor. She had been practicing business and contract law independently for 11 years, after a decade at one of the larger downtown firms. And she was the kind of attorney who kept her desk clear of everything that was not directly relevant to the matter in front of her. When the three of us sat down that Monday morning, the desk held 1 legal pad, 2 folders, and a cup of coffee. She did not touch for the entirety of our meeting. Philip spoke first. The entity is called Hartley Medical Trust LLC, he said. He had registered it the previous Thursday, the same afternoon I had left his office. The name was straightforward, a deliberate choice. He explained because anything too obscure attracted attention. The trust was a legitimate legal structure properly filed with the Tennessee Secretary of State, with full documentation and accurate timestamps on every transaction it processed. On paper, it was a medical payment intermediary. In practice, it was a funnel. The mechanism worked as follows. When I initiated a wire transfer of $1.9 million to the account Conrad had designated for the transplant payment, that money would route through Hartley Medical Trust before reaching its stated destination. Conrad's billing intermediary, one of the shell companies Philip had identified, would receive a confirmation of payment within hours, the kind of automated notification that financial systems generate without human review. Conrad would see what he expected to see: the funds had arrived. What Conrad would not see was the second leg of the transaction. Within 36 hours of the initial transfer, the full amount would move again from the trust's holding account back to a personal investment account in my name only. The documentation for the return transfer was already prepared, time-stamped to confirm it predated any contested claim. He gets a receipt, Philip said simply. You get the money back. I had built a company on understanding how goods moved through systems and where value was created or lost in transit. What Philip had constructed was the same logic applied to a different kind of cargo. The confirmation Conrad received was real. The money behind it was not where he thought it was. Nora set her folder open. In parallel, she said, I have been preparing documentation to support a claim of fraud in the inducement. She explained the concept in the direct, unornamented way that effective lawyers explain things when they want the listener to actually understand, rather than simply be impressed. Fraud in the inducement was a principle under Tennessee common law that allowed a court to void a contract, or, in this case, a series of asset transfer documents when one party had been persuaded to sign through deliberate misrepresentation. Conrad had represented the restructuring paperwork as routine tax planning. The evidence that it was in fact a coordinated scheme to strip me of marital assets under false pretenses was now documented across multiple layers. Every signature you put on those documents, Nora said, was obtained through fraud. Under Tennessee law, that means they can be challenged and reversed. She did not say it would be simple. She did not say it would be fast. She said it was solid, and coming from Nora, solid was the word that mattered. My phone buzzed once on the table. A message from Donna: call me after your meeting. Rita is ready to talk. I had asked Donna the previous week whether she knew anyone at Vanderbilt who had flagged concerns about the billing irregularities connected to the patient registered as Dana Forbes. Donna had gone quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone deciding how much they are willing to say, and then told me about Rita Okafor. Rita was the Director of Financial Compliance and Control at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. She had held the position for 9 years and had spent the better part of the previous 8 months trying to submit a formal complaint regarding a specific pattern of insurance billing irregularities connected to the hospital's transplant program. She had identified what appeared to be a case in which a patient's insurance coverage was being applied to a procedure for a different individual, a violation of federal healthcare fraud statutes that carried serious consequences under both the False Claims Act and the National Organ Transplant Act. She had submitted her findings internally. Her direct supervisor had advised her to let the matter rest. She had gone one level higher. The response had been the same. The patient in question had connections to the hospital's administrative donor network, and the institutional appetite for investigating those connections was limited. Rita had not let it rest. She had spent the intervening months building a parallel record her own documentation kept outside the hospital's internal systems, in preparation for submitting directly to the Office of Inspector General at the Department of Health and Human Services. The OIG operated independently of hospital administration. No internal supervisor could intercept or suppress a report filed directly with that office. What Rita needed and had not yet had was independent financial documentation originating from outside the hospital. Evidence that the billing irregularity was not an isolated administrative error, but part of a deliberate and coordinated scheme. The kind of evidence that a federal oversight body could not decline to act on. That was what I could give her. I called Donna from the elevator on the way down. She put Rita on. Rita's voice was precise and unhurried. The way people sound when they have been holding something together through patience alone and have finally found the right moment to let it move. We spoke for 12 minutes. By the end of the call, she had what she needed from me, and I had confirmed what I needed from her. The elevator doors opened in the lobby. Philip and I walked toward the entrance. My phone rang. Conrad, I answered on the second ring. His voice broke on the first word. Not performance. I had heard Conrad perform grief before, and it sounded nothing like this. This was the sound of a plan reaching its execution point, calibrated to land at exactly the right frequency. Vivienne, it's Mom. She had a difficult morning. The hospital ran some tests, kidney function, they said. It doesn't look good. We need to start thinking about what comes next. I looked at Philip. He looked at me. It begins, he said. The 3 months between Philip's words in that lobby and the phone call I had been waiting for were the longest I had spent doing nothing visible. The donor match Philip had flagged in August had required additional compatibility confirmation, a second cross match, a revised surgical timeline. Conrad had used the delay to finalize the financial structure. By November, everything on his side was ready. I had continued going to my book club on the second Thursday of each month. I had attended 2 charity functions that Conrad and I were expected to attend together. I had cooked dinner on the evenings he was home, asked the questions a wife asks, listened to the answers a husband gives when he believes everything is proceeding exactly as planned. I had become very good over those 3 months at the particular performance of ordinary life, and I had understood. Watching Conrad across dinner tables and in the parking lot of our church, and in the small, unremarkable moments of a shared household, that he had been performing the same thing for much longer than I had. We were both, it turned out, better actors than either of us had known. The call came on a Monday afternoon in November. Not from Conrad from the hospital, a billing coordinator, asking me to confirm that I was the primary financial contact for Loretta Ashford's admission. I said yes. I confirmed my name and phone number. I thanked them and ended the call. Then I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Publix on Franklin Road for 4 minutes before driving to Vanderbilt. The third-floor VIP corridor at Vanderbilt University Medical Center had a particular quality of quiet, not the silence of emptiness, but the controlled, managed silence of a place where sound had been deliberately reduced. Dimmer lighting than the floors below, wider doorways, the hum of equipment behind closed doors. It smelled of something antiseptic and neutral, and underneath that faintly of cut flowers from the arrangements that sat on the nursing station counter. Room 314 had its curtains drawn. I stood at the window in the door for a moment before entering. Loretta Ashford was in the bed nearest the window, connected to a cardiac monitor whose leads ran under the collar of her hospital gown, with an oxygen cannula fitted under her nose and an IV line in her left arm. Her hands lay open at her sides and they were trembling, a fine, continuous tremor, the kind that looks entirely involuntary because it is controlled at exactly the frequency where involuntary and performed become indistinguishable. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was audible from where I stood, slow and effortful in a way that would read to any observer as the breathing of someone whose body was working hard at a task that used to require no effort at all. She was 79 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, and had spent 34 years teaching 6-year-olds how to read. She knew how to hold a room. Conrad was standing at the foot of the bed. His eyes were red in a way that could have been grief or could have been the result of 20 minutes in a cold car with the heat turned off. He looked up when I pushed the door open, and something in his face shifted relief. I thought, though, I was no longer entirely sure I could trust my readings of Conrad's face. I set my hand briefly on Loretta's arm. She did not respond, only continued her careful breathing, and then followed Conrad into the hallway. He spoke quietly, his back half turned to the nursing station down the corridor. The story came out in the compressed, urgent rhythm of someone delivering information they had been waiting to deliver. A donor match had been confirmed that morning, a compatible kidney rare given Loretta's blood type and antibody profile. The kind of match that the transplant coordinator had described as unlikely to come around again soon. The surgical team was prepared. The procedure could be scheduled within days. But the hospital required a financial guarantor before they would proceed. A wire transfer of $1.9 million cleared within 48 hours. Conrad's voice dropped slightly on the number, not from embarrassment, but from the practiced instinct of a man who had delivered large figures in professional contexts for decades, and knew that the delivery mattered as much as the amount. He was waiting, he said, on a fund distribution that had been delayed. His accountant was working on it. A few more weeks, and he could have covered this himself without involving me. But the 48-hour window was real, and the match would not wait, and there was no one else he could ask. He looked at me in the way he had looked at me a handful of times over 31 years, not with affection exactly, but with the particular quality of attention a person gives someone they have correctly identified as essential. He needed me to say yes. He had constructed everything so that I would have no reason to say anything else. I looked through the window at Loretta. She lay perfectly still, chest rising and falling in that careful rhythm, hands open, face composed in the slack and uncomplicated expression of genuine illness. It was a very good performance. I had sat beside enough hospital beds in my life to know what that expression looked like on a real face. And she had reproduced it with the kind of accuracy that comes from observation rather than experience. For one brief moment as I watched her through the glass, her eyelids moved. Not a wince, not a reflexive flicker. A small, deliberate opening a quarter inch. No more, that lasted perhaps 2 seconds before closing again. In that 2 seconds, her eyes found my face through the window. What I saw in them was not the contempt I might have expected. It was something smaller and less certain than that. Something that looked, if I was being honest with myself, like a woman who had already decided something she could not take back. I turned back to Conrad. "I'll take care of it tomorrow morning," I said. He reached for my hand and squeezed it once hard, the way people grip something they are afraid of losing before they understand they have already lost it. He exhaled. His shoulders dropped half an inch. I did not let my expression change. I was aware, without looking directly, that 40 feet down the hallway, Donna Reeves was standing at the nursing station with a clipboard in her hands. I did not tell Conrad that. Donna looked up at the precise moment I needed her to held my gaze for exactly 1 second and returned her attention to the clipboard without any change in her posture. We had an agreement. It did not require words, and we did not use any. I wired $1.9 million on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, every cent had come back to me. The private banking suite at Pinnacle Financial's Green Hills branch occupied a corner of the second floor, separate from the main lobby, accessible through a side entrance. With its own waiting area and a consultation room that had upholstered chairs and soundproofed walls, and the particular stillness of a space designed for conversations involving significant amounts of money. I had been a client there for 11 years. My relationship manager was a woman named Carol, who had handled the sale proceeds from my company 2 years prior, and who understood, without needing it, explained that when I called ahead to request a private consultation for a large outgoing transfer, I did not want to conduct it at a teller window. She had the paperwork ready when I arrived at 9:15. I sat down, read through the transfer authorization, confirmed the receiving account number twice, and signed where indicated. The funds would leave my personal investment account and route to Crestline Medical Billing LLC, the account Conrad had provided within the standard processing window for a same-day wire. What Carol's paperwork did not reflect, because there was no reason it would, was what happened after that. Philip had explained the sequence to me twice in the careful way he explained things that needed to be understood precisely. When Crestline Medical Billing LLC received the incoming wire, the funds would trigger an automatic forwarding instruction already embedded in the account structure, an instruction that directed the balance to Hartley Medical Trust LLC, the entity Philip had registered in Tennessee 3 months earlier. From the trust, the funds would complete a second transfer back to a personal account in my name, one I had opened specifically for this purpose at a different institution. The entire cycle would take 36 hours. The documentation at each step was real time-stamped and legally traceable. At the far end of the chain, Conrad's billing system would generate an automated payment confirmation. Payment received. $1.9 million cleared and credited. The notification would go to the email address he had designated. He would see it on his phone before noon. He would see exactly what he had built the last 14 months to see. I signed the transfer authorization, thanked Carol, and left. Philip sent me a text message at 11:47 that morning. 3 words: confirmation sent. Done. I read it in the parking structure and put my phone in my bag. What I learned later through Philip, who had maintained surveillance on Conrad's movements throughout this period, was that Conrad spent part of that same Tuesday morning in a meeting at a private office suite in the Gulch neighborhood, approximately 4 miles from where I was sitting at Pinnacle Financial. The man he met was named Victor Strand. Strand was not a licensed financial institution. He operated in the space that exists between formal lending and arrangements that prefer not to leave detailed records, what people in certain professional circles called shadow financing, though Strand himself would have used more neutral language. He arranged short-term bridge loans for individuals who needed substantial capital quickly and quietly, outside the reporting requirements of conventional banks. A bridge loan in the straightforward sense was exactly what the name suggested. A temporary structure that carried you from one financial position to another while you waited for a larger source of funds to materialize. You borrowed the bridge. You crossed it. You paid back the lender with interest when your expected money arrived. Conrad had borrowed $2.3 million from Victor Strand on a 30-day term at a rate that reflected the informal nature of the arrangement. The logic was clean. From Conrad's perspective, Vivian's $1.9 million would come in. He would combine it with funds he already controlled, settle the Strand obligation on time, and close the entire structure before any of it became visible to anyone positioned to ask questions. As of Tuesday morning, with the payment confirmation sitting in his email, Conrad believed he was on schedule. I arrived at Vanderbilt at 2 in the afternoon. Loretta's room was exactly as I had left it the day before. Dim light equipment humming the faint antiseptic smell that the cut flowers on the windowsill were not quite enough to cover. A different nurse was on duty, a younger woman, who updated me briefly on Loretta's vitals and told me the surgical team would be by in the evening to go through pre-operative preparation. I thanked her and settled into the chair beside the bed. For the next 3 hours, I did what a woman in my position was expected to do. I paged through 2 issues of a magazine I did not read. I asked the nursing staff whether Loretta had been comfortable overnight and thanked them when they said she had. I made a cup of tea from the small hospitality setup in the corner of the room and held it without drinking very much of it. I watched the monitor beside the bed display Loretta's cardiac rhythm in the steady, untroubled pattern of a woman whose heart was functioning exactly as it should. Loretta lay with her eyes closed and her breathing measured and her hands at her sides, and I sat in the chair 3 feet away and read a magazine article I would not remember. And neither of us said what we actually knew. The room was very quiet. There is a particular quality to the silence between 2 people who are both performing something. I had noticed it during the years when Conrad and I had stopped being honest with each other, but had not yet acknowledged it. You could feel the shape of the unspoken things pressing against the edges of ordinary conversation, taking up space without being named. That Tuesday afternoon in room 314. The silence had a different texture, denser, more deliberate. The silence of 2 women, each waiting for something the other one did not know she was also waiting for. I drove home at 9 that evening. I made chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table until the windows went dark around me, and the neighborhood went quiet and the clock on the wall moved past midnight without me particularly noticing. The surgical team had confirmed the procedure for 6 the following morning. I had set an alarm I did not expect to need. I was not nervous. I had not been nervous in several weeks. What I felt sitting in the kitchen with a cooling cup of tea was something that did not have a clean name, not calm exactly, not readiness exactly, but something in the territory between the two. The feeling of having done everything that could be done and arrived at the place where all that remained was to let it happen. I had told myself I was not nervous, and I believed it when I drove away from Vanderbilt at 9 o'clock that evening. By 11 I was back. I could not have explained it precisely. The house was quiet in the way houses get quiet when they are waiting for something to end, and I had sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I did not drink, and listened to the refrigerator and the street outside and the particular quality of silence that settles over a place where a decision has already been made. There was nothing left to do. Everything that could be set in motion had been set in motion weeks ago. I understood that. I drove back anyway. The second-floor waiting area at Vanderbilt at 11:30 on a Tuesday night was nearly empty. A man in his 50s sat near the television in the corner watching something with the volume turned low. A woman closer to the elevators had her head resting against the wall with her eyes closed. Whether sleeping or simply resting, I could not tell. The overhead lights had been dimmed to the lower evening setting, and the room had the subdued, suspended quality of a place where time was moving at a different rate than it did outside. I found a chair near the window and sat down. My phone had 2 messages. Nora Fenn first. Everything sealed and ready, waiting on your signal. Phillips came in 4 minutes after hers. Rita submitted to HHSOIG at 5 this afternoon. Out of anyone's hands now. I read both messages twice, set the phone face down on my knee, and looked out the window at the parking structure lights below. Out of anyone's hands. That was the particular relief of having done something correctly, not the relief of having done something easy, but the specific and durable relief of having done something that could not be undone by anyone else's intervention. Every piece was in place. The legal documentation, the financial record, the OIG submission, the compliance flags that would activate the moment Conrad moved to formalize what he believed he had already secured. I had spent 3 months building something, and it was built, and now I was waiting for the moment it would become visible. 31 years. I kept returning to that number not with grief, but with something that felt more like clarity, the particular kind of clarity that arrives after a long time of seeing things in partial light. 31 years of a life built alongside another person, of choices made and habits formed, and mornings accumulated into something that feels like it simply is. The way the furniture in a room simply is until the moment you are asked to look at it directly and describe what you actually see. Conrad had said something in the first year of our marriage that I had carried without examining too closely for 3 decades. We had been arguing civilly the way two people argue when they are still trying to understand, rather than win about something I no longer remember. A decision about the apartment, or a dinner. We had both forgotten to plan something genuinely small. In the middle of it, he had stopped, looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before or since, and said, "You're the smartest person I've ever met, Vivienne." Not a compliment offered to end the argument. A statement of fact delivered with the seriousness of a man taking inventory. I had thought about it often in recent months. He was right in the way that people are right about things they understand, and then choose to use, rather than simply appreciate. He had known what I was from the beginning. He had also known from the beginning that a direct confrontation with someone like me would never succeed. I would see it. I would question it. I would not yield on something I had examined carefully. So he had never confronted me directly. Not once in 31 years. Instead, he had worked with the grain of who I was. He had built structures that looked like trust because he understood I moved toward trust. He had used my belief in him as the load-bearing wall of everything he constructed, so that questioning him meant questioning something I had chosen repeatedly daily for 3 decades. It was, I thought, the most sophisticated thing he had ever done. More sophisticated than any case he had tried, any argument he had made in front of a judge. He had taken the thing he most respected about me and made it the mechanism of the trap. I heard him before I saw him. The elevator doors and then footsteps with the particular rhythm I had learned to identify across 3 floors of any building we had ever been in together. He found me by the window. He sat down in the chair beside me without speaking, the way he had learned somewhere in the first decade of marriage that I did not always need words immediately. He sat for a moment looking at the same nothing I had been looking at, and then he reached over and took my hand. His hand was warm. That surprised me for a reason I could not account for. We sat like that for several minutes. The man near the television changed the channel. The woman against the wall shifted in her sleep. Outside, a car moved slowly through the parking structure and disappeared. "Thank you for being here, Viv," Conrad said. His voice was quiet and even and entirely without the quality that would have told me he was performing something. This I thought was real. Whatever else was false, this was not. He was grateful that I was sitting beside him, and the gratitude was genuine, and it came from the same place that everything else about us had come from: the actual 31 years. The actual history, the actual person he had been, before he had become the person who decided I was something to be managed rather than loved. I did not say anything. I let my hand stay in his. I let him hold my hand. And I thought, as clearly as I have ever thought anything in my life, this is the last kind thing I will do for Conrad Ashford. The surgical floor of Vanderbilt's transplant wing opened to family members at 6 in the morning. I was there at 5:45. The night had passed in the waiting area downstairs the way nights pass in hospitals, not in sleep and not entirely in wakefulness, but in that particular suspended state where the body rests and the mind does not. I had dozed for perhaps 90 minutes in the chair by the window, woken to the sound of a shift change at the nursing station, and spent the remaining hours watching the sky outside go from black to purple to the flat, overcast gray of a December morning in Tennessee. By the time the elevator doors opened on the fourth floor, I had been awake long enough to feel entirely clear. Conrad was already there. He was standing near the windows at the far end of the corridor, his jacket still on his phone in his hand. When he saw me, something in his posture shifted a small adjustment, the kind a person makes when they realize they have been seen doing something they would rather not explain. He put his phone in his pocket and walked toward me. "You stayed," he said. "I did," I said. We found chairs in the waiting area near the surgical suite and sat down, and the morning began its long work of passing. I watched him. I had sat beside Conrad Ashford in waiting rooms before in the early years during his mother's hip surgery, during his father's final hospitalization, during the various medical appointments that accumulate across the decades of a shared life. I had always known what his worry looked like. It was specific and recognizable. He went still instead of pacing. His attention narrowed and he became quiet in a way that was different from his ordinary quiet. I had known that version of Conrad the way you know the sounds a house makes in different kinds of weather. The man across from me that morning was not that man. This Conrad paced. He checked his phone every few minutes with the particular urgency of someone waiting for a message they cannot afford to miss. He looked at the clock on the wall, then at his watch, as if one of them might tell him something the other hadn't. When a nurse passed the waiting area, his head came up. When the surgical suite doors opened for anything other than the moment he was waiting for, he registered it and returned to his circuit. He was worried, genuinely, visibly worried. But the worry was not the kind a son carries for a mother. It was the kind a man carries when something he needs very much to go correctly is in other people's hands and he cannot control it. I had spent 31 years learning the difference between the two. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and watched him move, and understood with the clear and irrevocable quality of a thing finally seen in full light, that I had known him less well than I had believed. I had known the surface carefully and thoroughly. The architecture underneath had been something else entirely. At 9:40, Donna came through the corridor. She was moving with the efficient, purposeful walk of a senior staff member with somewhere specific to be. She did not glance at the waiting area as she passed. She did not slow down. But as she moved alongside the row of chairs where I was sitting, her right hand dropped briefly to the empty seat beside me and left something there before she continued around the corner. I waited a full minute before picking it up. A piece of paper folded into quarters, the kind torn from a standard notepad. I opened it in my lap below the line of sight of anyone across the room. 3 items written in Donna's small, precise handwriting, room 412. Post-op. D. Forbes. Post-operative care for a patient listed under the name I recognized as Delaney Frost's alias. 4th floor, the same floor I was sitting on. I folded the paper once, put it in the inside pocket of my jacket, and returned my hands to my lap. The morning continued. Conrad sat for a while, paced for a while, checked his phone for a while. At one point, he brought me a cup of coffee from the machine in the alcove down the hall, black, no sugar, which was how I had taken it for 31 years, and which I thought, in a distant way, was a strange detail to still be accurate. I drank half of it. We did not talk very much. There was nothing either of us could say to the other that was entirely true, and we had both learned somewhere across the years that partial truths were more exhausting than silence. At 2:17 in the afternoon, the surgical suite doors opened and a woman in scrubs walked toward us with the measured pace of someone delivering news they had delivered many times before. She was in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead and the calm, direct manner of a transplant surgeon at the end of a long and successful procedure. "Everything went smoothly," she said. "She's in recovery. We'll have an update within the hour." She did not name the patient. She did not need to. Conrad exhaled. The sound of it was the sound of pressure releasing from something that had been compressed for a long time, weeks, months longer than I could fully calculate. He turned toward me and put his arms around me, and the hug was real, in the physical sense. His arms were solid and his grip was firm, and his voice when he spoke was unsteady. "We did it," he said. His chin was above my shoulder, his face turned toward the corridor. I felt him settle. I felt the tension go out of his frame. I let him hold on. Over his shoulder, I watched the hallway begin to clear. The surgical team dispersed in ones and twos. The corridor went quieter. And on Conrad's face, in the brief moment before he pulled back and composed himself into something more presentable, I saw something I had not seen there in a very long time. Not relief exactly, not gratitude. Something more complete than either of those things, the specific, settled calm of a man who has been waiting for a plan to succeed and has just watched it succeed exactly as he designed it. A man with nothing left to worry about. A man who believes the difficult part is over. He had no way of knowing it was just beginning. Before I tell you what Vivian heard behind that door, type "ready" in the comments. Because what came through that hospital room wall in Loretta's own voice was the kind of thing you cannot unhear. Neither could Vivian. This story blends fiction with purpose. Names, places, and some events have been shaped for storytelling, but the truth underneath them is worth your time. The morning after the surgery, I bought 2 cups of coffee from the cart on the second floor and carried them up to the third. This required no particular planning. I had been bringing Loretta Ashford coffee on Sunday mornings for 26 years from the early years, when Conrad and I visited his parents in Franklin every weekend without fail, through the middle years, when the visits became less frequent. But the coffee remained the same ritual. 2 cups. Black for Conrad, 1 sugar for Loretta, delivered without ceremony, because that was the kind of thing you did in a long marriage with a family you had married into and decided, somewhere along the way, to claim as your own. That Thursday morning, I brought it one last time. The third-floor corridor was quiet at 9:40. The overnight staff had finished their rounds, and the morning staff had settled into the particular rhythm of a hospital day, the measured traffic of people who knew where they were going and why, with none of the uncertainty of visiting hours. I walked the length of the hallway with a cup in each hand past the family consultation room with its frosted glass panel, past the housekeeping cart parked neatly against the wall, past the whiteboard near the nursing station where shift assignments were written in dry erase marker that someone had partially erased and not yet replaced. Ordinary details, the kind of details that accumulate in the background of every significant moment and are only visible afterward when you understand which moments were significant. I walked with the particular focus of a woman who has made a decision so completely that second-guessing it would require an effort she was no longer capable of. I was 10 feet from Loretta's door when I heard the laughter. I stopped. It was not the sound of a sick woman. It was not the careful, effortful sound that someone makes when they are trying to maintain the appearance of being well enough to accept a visitor. It was the full, unself-conscious laughter of a woman who had forgotten for a moment that she was supposed to be somewhere between ill and recovering. It was the sound of relief, of something concluded, of a person who had been performing for a sustained period and had finally put the performance down. I stood still in the middle of the corridor. A nurse passed behind me, moving in the other direction, and I shifted slightly to one side without turning around. The cups were warm in my hands. The corridor smelled of the same antiseptic neutrality it had smelled of for the past several days, and for a long moment I simply stood there holding 2 cups of coffee, listening to the particular quality of laughter coming through a partially closed hospital door. I took 2 steps to my left and stood with my back against the wall beside the door. My right hand still held both cups. With my left hand, I reached into my pocket and found my phone. I pressed record. Tennessee is a one-party consent state, meaning that any person who is present in a conversation may legally record it without notifying the other parties. I was present. The hallway was a shared space. Everything I was about to hear was under the law mine to keep. I listened. Loretta's voice was the first thing clear and specific. With the particular authority of a woman who had spent 3 decades managing classrooms of small children and had never entirely lost the register. The oxygen cannula was gone. The careful tremor in her hands, the labored breathing, the slack expression of genuine exhaustion, all of it was gone. What remained was a 79-year-old woman sitting up straight in a hospital bed she had never needed, talking to her son. "We did it, Conrad." She sounded satisfied. Not relieved. Satisfaction is different from relief. It carries the weight of expectation fulfilled. "Now get that woman out. She has done everything we needed from her, and I am very tired of this room." I stood against the wall and listened and did not move. There was a pause on the other side of the door. I could hear the particular quality of the room, the low hum of a monitor that had nothing to monitor, the sound of a chair shifting weight. When Conrad spoke, his voice was lower, but not quiet enough. "The lawyers have everything prepared. By Friday, she walks away without a thing. She signed it all herself months ago. It's airtight." I thought about March. The thick folder on the desk in the upstairs study. The yellow tabs. Conrad refilling my wine glass while I worked through the pages he had prepared. And the way he had said it was standard. The way he had said every attorney he knew had done the same thing, and the way I had believed him, because I had chosen across 31 years to believe him about the things that fell inside what I thought of as his area of professional knowledge. I thought about how carefully he had calibrated the entire structure around what he knew about me. "Good." Loretta's voice again, carrying the particular dismissiveness of a woman who had been waiting for a conclusion and had arrived at it with her full capacity for impatience intact. "I never liked her anyway. You should have known better than to marry someone like that. Always so certain of herself." There was a silence then, the kind that happens when one person says something that the other person does not answer because the answer would complicate what needs to stay simple. "Conrad, it worked out." "Loretta, it always does when you plan properly." I pressed stop. I stood with my back against the wall for a long moment, both cups of coffee still in my hand. The recording had run 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I could hear distantly the sound of the elevator at the end of the corridor opening and closing, and the footsteps of someone arriving on the floor. And then nothing again except the controlled quiet of a hospital morning going about its ordinary business. I thought about 26 years of Sunday mornings, the drives out to Franklin in the thin early light, when the highway was still mostly empty, and Conrad would have the radio on low, and we would not talk very much, because neither of us needed to. The kitchen table in the house where he had grown up, with the window that looked out over the back garden and the particular quality of light that came through it on winter mornings. Loretta's way of sitting straight-backed, both hands wrapped around her mug, watching the room with the composed attention of someone who had spent decades being the authority in contained spaces and had never entirely set that role down. The way she had looked at me across that table year after year with an expression I had always interpreted as reserved approval. The kind of approval that was real, but conditional. The kind that a mother extends to the woman her son has chosen when she has decided the woman is acceptable, but has not decided anything warmer than that. I had read that expression for 26 years and had built around my reading of it a small and private sense of being included. Chosen by association, belonging to something larger than myself. I thought about the word she had used. That woman. Not Vivienne. Not her name. 26 years and 100 Sunday mornings, and I had been that woman the entire time. I set both coffee cups on the narrow ledge of the supply cart outside the next room along the hall. Set them down carefully, as if they were something that deserved to be handled with consideration even at the end. Then I turned and walked back the way I had come, past the whiteboard and the housekeeping cart and the frosted glass panel of the consultation room, and pressed the elevator button and went down one floor. I walked the length of the second-floor corridor and found the waiting area I had occupied for 8 hours the previous day. The chairs were the same. The windows looked out on the same parking structure with the same light moving across the same concrete surfaces in the same unhurried way. The overhead lights were the same particular shade of institutional fluorescent that had accompanied every hour I had spent in this building across the past week. I sat down in the same chair I had sat in while watching Conrad pace. I set my phone on the arm of the chair face up. The screen showed the recording I had just made, 4 minutes and 11 seconds of two people in a hospital room saying out loud, in complete confidence, what they had arranged and executed across the previous 14 months. The kind of conversation that only happens when people believe themselves to be entirely safe, when they have accounted for every variable and found no remaining risk. I had been in the legal world long enough through Conrad's career, through my own business dealings, through 17 years of reading contracts and understanding what the language inside them meant in practice, to know exactly what a recording like that was worth. Not abstractly, specifically. With a clear and unambiguous understanding of what it could do in whose hands, through what channels toward what outcome. I sat in the chair. I did not reach for my phone. I did not call Philip or Nora or Donna. I had spent 3 months in motion gathering building positioning, waiting, and what the moment called for now was none of those things. What it called for was the particular quality of stillness that comes after a very long effort has reached the place it was always moving toward. I simply sat with what I had and let it settle around me. And then I did something I had not done in a very long time. I smiled, not at anyone, not for anyone, not because anything about the situation was funny or light or uncomplicated. I smiled because I finally understood exactly where I stood and where Conrad stood, and the considerable distance between those two positions. It was not a large smile. It did not require an audience. It was simply the expression of a woman who had done what she came to do and knew it. I had moved from the waiting area to the main lobby at 11:30. Not because I had anywhere specific to be, but because sitting in the same chair for a second consecutive morning felt like a kind of stagnation I was not willing to accept. The lobby on the first floor had better light, wide glass panels running the length of the entrance. The kind of architectural choice that makes a building feel less like a place where people wait and more like a place where things begin. I found a seat near the windows, set my bag on the floor beside me, and watched the Thursday noon traffic move through the automatic doors. Conrad came through them at 12 minutes past 12. He was wearing a jacket I recognized, charcoal gray, bought in Chicago 3 years ago, on a trip we had taken for his firm's national conference. He had his phone in his left hand and a manila envelope in his right. And he walked with the particular quality of purposefulness that I had spent 31 years watching move through rooms ahead of me. He saw me from across the lobby and adjusted his route without breaking stride. He set the envelope on the small table beside my chair. I looked at it. Then I looked at him. "I think you know what that is," he said. His voice was even almost gentle, with the professional register of a man who had delivered difficult news in formal settings so many times that the difficulty had been smoothed out of it. He sat down in the chair across from me and leaned back slightly, giving the posture of a man who was comfortable with what he was about to say. "The house in Brentwood is in my name. The joint investment accounts were transferred under the restructuring documents you signed last March. The Germantown property, the portfolio, all of it has been properly documented and notarized." He paused. "You signed the transfers yourself, Vivienne. Every page. My lawyers are prepared to finalize by end of week." I picked up the envelope. I opened it the way I open most documents, from the top, methodically giving each page the attention it was owed. The divorce petition, the asset declaration, listing what had formerly been ours and confirming what now stood in Conrad's name alone. The waiver of contested proceedings, which his lawyers had included as a courtesy, or perhaps as an efficiency. The signature lines, each marked with a small adhesive flag. I knew every page, not because I had seen these specific documents, but because I had spent enough time with Nora Fenn over the previous 3 months to understand their structure precisely, to know what each clause meant and what it would mean once signed, and what it would mean for considerably less time than Conrad believed. Conrad had filed the divorce petition 4 months earlier, part of the same plan prepared in advance, the way everything else had been prepared. The 60-day statutory waiting period under Tennessee law had already run. Today's signatures were the final procedural step, nothing more. I signed. I worked through the pages with the same deliberation I had brought to every contract I had signed in 17 years of running a company, careful enough to confirm what I was agreeing to, efficient enough not to treat the process as more consequential than it was. When I reached the last flag, I signed that one too, set the pen on the table, and returned the documents to the envelope. Conrad watched me through this. I felt his attention on each page, and I felt the particular quality of his attention shift when I did not slow down, did not pause, did not look up with the expression of someone encountering resistance in themselves. A man who is prepared for negotiation and found none experiences a specific kind of recalibration. It lasted perhaps a second, the fractional hesitation of someone adjusting their understanding of a situation they believed they had fully mapped. He recovered it smoothly. He always did. "That's the right decision," he said, picking up the envelope. "Prolonging this wouldn't have helped either of us." He stood, straightened his jacket with one hand in the habit I had watched 10,000 times, and looked at me with the expression of a man concluding a meeting that had gone more or less as expected. "I hope you'll be all right, Vivienne." "I'm sure I will," I said. He walked toward the exit. I watched him cross the lobby, pass through the automatic doors, and disappear into the parking structure beyond. I counted in my head without moving. 1, 2, 3. Then I took my phone from my bag, found Philip's number, and called. He answered before the second ring. "Now," I said. One word. It was all that was needed. Philip and I had discussed this moment with the same precision we had brought to every other element of what we had built over the previous 3 months. He knew what the word meant. He knew what would follow it and in what sequence and to whom the various pieces would be delivered. He said nothing in response, only the brief, confirming silence of a man who has been waiting for an instruction and has received it. I ended the call and set my phone on the arm of the chair. The lobby continued around me. People moved through the glass doors. A child in a stroller pointed at something outside that delighted her. 2 men in suits passed through from the parking structure with the distracted energy of people running slightly late. Ordinary Thursday afternoon movement through a hospital lobby. Unremarkable and continuous and entirely indifferent to the fact that 14 months of careful patient construction had just arrived at the moment it had been built for. I sat for another few minutes. Then I picked up my bag, and found a quiet corner near the windows where I could see both the entrance and the elevators. Conrad's first call came at 4:47 that afternoon. I was still in the lobby. I had not left. I watched his name appear on my screen. The phone vibrated in my hand, steady and insistent, the way Conrad himself had always been certain that his calls would be answered, that the people he needed would be where he expected them to be, that the world he had arranged would behave according to his arrangement. I watched the screen until the call went to voicemail. Then I set the phone face down in my lap and waited for it to ring again. He called 11 times. I know that number precisely because I counted not out of any particular sentiment, but because counting was something I had always done when I needed to keep my mind from moving ahead of the moment it was in. 11 calls between 4:47 and 6:15. I watched each one arrive, register, and expire on my screen. On the 5th, I answered. He did not say hello. That was the first departure from the Conrad I had known, the Conrad who had maintained across 31 years and every difficult conversation we had ever had. The formal courtesy of a man who understood that how you began a conversation shaped everything that followed. "My accounts aren't processing," he said. His voice had a quality I had not heard in it before, not anger exactly, but the particular tension of a man who has discovered that something he was certain of is no longer true. Transfers are failing. My cards aren't going through at any institution. That sounds like a bank issue, I said. This is not a bank issue, Vivienne. The use of my full name, not Viv, not the shorthand of a long marriage, but the formal version. The one he used in professional settings when precision mattered. This is you. I let the silence extend for several seconds. In a negotiation, silence is not an absence of communication. It is communication of a specific kind, the kind that tells the other party that you are not in a hurry and that their urgency does not transfer. Did something go wrong with your tax plan, Conrad? I asked. I ended the call before he could answer. My phone buzzed with a message from Philip 2 minutes later. I read it carefully twice. Compliance flags confirmed across 3 financial institutions. A compliance flag in the language of American banking law was what happened when a financial institution's automated monitoring systems detected transaction patterns that fell outside normal parameters, patterns that triggered mandatory reporting to federal regulators under the Bank Secrecy Act. 3 institutions flagging simultaneously meant the irregularity was not subtle and was not going to be quietly resolved. Marcus Weld filed formal notice with the Tennessee Board of Professional Responsibility this morning. The board was the state body that governed attorney conduct in Tennessee, the entity with authority to investigate, sanction, and disbar lawyers who violated their professional obligations. What Marcus had filed was not a complaint that could be delayed or managed internally. It was a formal record in a system that moved on its own timeline. Marcus also contacted the FBI Nashville field office, wire fraud federal jurisdiction. I set the phone on the arm of the chair. Wire fraud under federal law was the use of electronic communications, phone calls, wire transfers, emails to execute a scheme to defraud. Conrad had used wire transfers to move money through entities he had constructed specifically to deceive. He had used phone lines and email confirmations to sustain the deception across multiple months and multiple parties. The federal jurisdiction piece meant that the investigation would not sit in a local prosecutor's inbox waiting for prioritization. The FBI moved on its own schedule. I had been sitting with this information for approximately 90 seconds when Marcus Weld walked into the waiting area. I had known Marcus Weld for 24 years, long enough to recognize the precise quality of his posture when he was carrying something he had not wanted to carry and had carried anyway, because the alternative was worse. He was in his early 60s, trim with the deliberate economy of movement that characterized people who had learned through long experience that careful was almost always faster than quick. He looked around the room, found me near the windows, and came directly over. He sat down in the chair across from me without being invited, which told me something about the register of the conversation he had come to have. He set a folder on the table between us. I noticed the firm's address on those entities 6 weeks ago, he said. No preamble, no softening. This was a man who had rehearsed this moment and decided that the version without ceremony was the honest one. I should have acted when I first saw it. I didn't move quickly enough, and I want you to know that I understand the cost of that. He looked at me directly. I'm sorry, Vivienne. I looked at the folder, then at Marcus. 24 years ago, he and Conrad had built Ashford and Weld from a 2-attorney practice in a shared suite on 2nd Avenue into a firm with 11 partners and a reputation that carried weight in federal and state courts alike. 24 years of shared cases, shared clients, shared professional identity. What Marcus had done by filing with the board and contacting the FBI had cost him something that could not be measured in quarterly numbers, something that would take years to fully understand the shape of. You acted when you had enough to act on, I said. That's all anyone can do. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once with the compact precision of a man who had hoped for exactly that and had not let himself expect it. My phone registered Conrad's 8th call. I did not answer it. The sound of it was different now. There was a pace to the intervals between calls that had shifted from insistence to something closer to desperation. I noticed it the way you notice a change in weather before you can name what the weather is becoming. Philip's next message arrived 40 seconds later. Victor Strand has been calling Conrad since 4:30. The 30-day bridge loan matured today. Full amount due with interest. Conrad has no available funds to service it. A pause in the message thread and then a second line. Strand is not a patient creditor. I understood what that meant. A man who operated in the space Victor Strand occupied did not make formal demands through attorneys or extend professional courtesies to clients who defaulted. He called. He kept calling. He made certain the person on the other end understood the specific nature of the problem. Conrad, at this particular moment, was receiving pressure from 3 directions. Simultaneously, the compliance flags locking his accounts, the formal proceedings Marcus had initiated, and a creditor with neither the temperament nor the legal constraints of a conventional lender. Conrad's 9th call came and went. I stood and walked to the windows that looked down over the front entrance of the building and the parking structure beyond. 2 dark sedans were moving slowly through the entrance to the Vanderbilt parking structure, unhurried, deliberate, following the lanes with the particular patience of vehicles that did not need to rush because their destination was not going anywhere. They were not here for a patient. They were not here for a family waiting on news. They were not here for any of the ordinary reasons that brought people to this building on a Thursday afternoon in December. I watched them find spaces on the lower level and go still. I came down from the 2nd floor at 5:45, not because I had planned to be in the lobby at that specific time, but because there are moments when a building communicates something through the quality of its traffic, a change in the density of movement, a different register in the sounds from one floor to another, and I had spent enough time in this particular building to notice when that quality shifted. The lobby at 5:45 had a specific feeling it had not had at noon or at 4 o'clock. Something had changed in the air pressure of the place. I took the stairs rather than the elevator. I wanted the transition, the physical movement from one level to another, the brief enclosed space of the stairwell, the moment of arriving somewhere on my own terms. By the time I pushed through the door into the main lobby, I had been in this building for 11 hours across 2 days. And I knew its rhythms the way you come to know any place where you have spent sustained time waiting for something. I found a position near the reception desk and waited. The lobby on a Thursday afternoon in December had the composition of a place where different kinds of urgency moved alongside each other without acknowledgement. A man in his 70s sat near the windows with a paper bag on his lap, looking at the entrance doors with the patient attention of someone who had learned through long practice how to wait. 2 women stood near the coffee kiosk with voices too low to carry. A child in a yellow coat ran small circuits between the chairs until an adult redirected her without interrupting a phone call. I watched all of it with the peripheral attention of a person whose focus was elsewhere, holding my position and letting the room move around me. Conrad came out of the elevator bank at 5:52. He was still on the phone. His jacket was the same charcoal one from the morning, though it sat differently on him now, slightly less precise. The collar displaced by a long day and a great deal of movement. He had always carried himself with a particular quality of forward momentum, the posture of someone who had somewhere specific to be and had calculated the most efficient path to it. That quality was present now, but had changed in register. This was not the momentum of a man on his way somewhere. It was the momentum of a man trying to stay ahead of something. He did not see the 2 men positioned to his left until he was 4 steps out of the elevator. They did not move dramatically. There was no raised voice, no physical confrontation, no cinematic intensity of the kind that makes people stop and stare. The 2 FBI agents stepped forward with the quiet authority of people who had done this before and had learned that the absence of theater made everything proceed more efficiently. One of them spoke in a voice that was professional and audible and entirely without urgency, reading the charges in the level-practiced cadence of a formal proceeding. Wire fraud. The use of electronic communications to execute a scheme to defraud, specifically the construction of shell entities, and the solicitation of a fraudulent wire transfer under false pretenses. I heard those words and thought about a Tuesday morning at a private bank in Green Hills and a signature on a transfer authorization. and the particular quality of calm I had felt doing something that looked exactly like what Conrad wanted it to look like. Fraud in the inducement, the procurement of signed legal documents through deliberate material misrepresentation, rendering those documents voidable under Tennessee law and actionable under federal statute where wire and mail communications were used to facilitate them. I heard those words and thought about a March evening, a thick folder and 14 signatures, while Conrad refilled a glass of wine and answered emails on his phone. Medical fraud under the National Organ Transplant Act. The falsification of medical records and insurance documentation to obtain organ transplant priority. For a patient under a false identity, a federal felony carrying significant prison exposure per count. I heard those words and thought about a young woman in room 412 with dark hair and a green silk scarf, who had believed what she needed to believe because she was 33 years old and dying, and the man she trusted had told her it was the only way. I stood 15 feet away and heard all of it. Conrad's phone was no longer at his ear. I watched the sequence of his reactions with the particular attention of someone who had spent 31 years learning to read a face, the initial physical stillness, the rapid recalculation behind his eyes, the fractional moment where he assessed the room for options and found none. His hands came together in front of him without resistance. He had been a lawyer for over 3 decades. He understood in this moment exactly what the moment was. The training that had made him formidable across a long career now worked in the opposite direction. He could see the shape of what had been built around him with greater clarity than most people in his position, and what he saw left no room for optimism. He looked around the lobby. I knew what he was looking for. He found me near the reception desk. Our eyes met across 15 feet of lobby floor and the flat afternoon light coming through the entrance windows. And we held that for a long moment, longer than it might have seemed from the outside, shorter than it felt from within. I did not look away. I did not move toward him and did not step back. There was nothing in my expression that I was trying to communicate, and nothing in it I was trying to suppress. I simply looked at the man I had been married to for 31 years in the lobby of the hospital where the plan he had spent 14 months building had just come apart. And I let him see exactly what was there. 31 years of mornings, the apartment in East Nashville and the cold pizza, and the conversations about a future we were both building toward. The silences that grew between us, and the night I found a receipt in a jacket pocket and stood in a kitchen deciding what kind of woman I intended to be. All of it was there in those 15 feet, and neither of us had words adequate to it. I am not certain what he saw in my face. Calm, perhaps. Recognition. The particular quality of someone who has arrived somewhere they had been moving toward for a long time and finds upon arrival that it looks exactly as they expected. One of the agents touched Conrad's arm and he looked away. Rita Okafor appeared at my left elbow without sound. She was in her late 40s with the composed, unhurried manner of someone who spent her professional life in the deliberate management of institutional complexity. I had spoken with her by phone 3 months ago and formed a clear impression. The person standing beside me confirmed it in full. She extended an official document bearing the seal of the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General. The OIG formally accepted the submission at 5 o'clock, she said. Insurance fraud charges fall under separate federal jurisdiction. Different prosecutorial track, different agency. They run parallel. She held the document until I took it. The attorneys handling the transplant fraud allegations are already in contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Middle District of Tennessee. She paused. Loretta Ashford's financial accounts were frozen approximately 20 minutes ago, she said more quietly. An emergency asset preservation order. She's still in her room on the 3rd floor. She doesn't know yet. I looked at the formal seal, the submission number, the date. The thing Rita had spent 8 months trying to place in the right hands, stopped once by institutional caution. Finally delivered because someone outside the building had provided the independent evidence that made inaction impossible. Thank you, I said, for all of it. Not just tonight. She nodded once and returned to the movement of the lobby, already looking at her phone, because for Rita Okafor, this moment was one point in a much longer process that was only beginning. Marcus Weld was near the main entrance, slightly apart from the foot traffic moving through the automatic doors. He was watching the space near the elevator bank where two federal agents completed the procedural steps of an arrest with the same quiet efficiency they had brought to the entire encounter. His expression was the expression of a man watching something he had known was coming and had not been able to stop himself from hoping would not. 24 years of professional partnership. Shared cases, shared clients, the particular intimacy of people who built something together over a very long time. Marcus had done the right thing, filed. The notice contacted the FBI, come to the waiting room with a folder and an apology, and doing the right thing had not made it cost less. It had simply made it necessary. He walked across the lobby, after a moment stopped in front of me, and nodded one small, deliberate movement containing something in the territory between acknowledgement and apology, and the particular respect one person extends to another when they have witnessed something difficult handled with more composure than the situation required. I nodded back. He turned and walked out through the automatic doors into the December evening. I thanked Rita at the edge of the lobby quietly. I thanked Marcus at the door briefly. Both of them had done something that cost something real, and I believed in naming that when I saw it because unnamed things had a way of becoming invisible, and invisible things had a way of being repeated. Then I walked to the elevator bank and pressed the button for the 4th floor. There was one more stop I needed to make before I left this building. The 4th floor was quieter than everything below it. That was the first thing I noticed when the elevator doors opened, not just the absence of the lobby's movement or the procedural sounds of the arrest, but a deeper kind of quiet. The post-operative recovery wing had its own particular register. The low, rhythmic sound of monitoring equipment, the soft displacement of air from the ventilation system, the muted footsteps of nursing staff on floors designed to absorb sound. It was a floor where the body's work was happening underneath the surface, and the environment had been shaped around that fact. I had rehearsed what I would say during the walk down the hallway. By the time I reached the door of room 412, I had forgotten all of it. Donna's note, the one she had passed to me during the surgery morning room 412 post-op, D. Forbes, had been in my jacket pocket for the better part of 2 days. I had known from the moment I read it that I would end up here. Not because I had a strategic purpose, but because there are things you need to look at directly before you can fully understand what you have been part of. And I had spent too long in this situation looking at documents and photographs and financial records to feel that I understood the whole of it. I knocked. A voice from inside said, "Come in." I pushed the door open. Delaney Frost was propped against the raised head of the hospital bed, a thin blanket across her legs and an IV line still running into her left arm. She was 33 years old, and she looked, in that moment, considerably younger, the particular quality of diminishment that comes after a long physical ordeal, when the body has spent everything it had and is beginning the slow work of rebuilding from whatever is left. Her dark hair was pulled back. Her face had the pallor of someone who had been ill for a very long time before anyone outside a hospital had seen it. She was awake. Her eyes tracked to the door when I entered and then to my face with a sharpness that told me the rest of her might be depleted, but her attention was entirely intact. I told her my name. The silence that followed lasted longer than silences usually do. She did not look away from me. She was, I understood, processing something that required more than a moment, the arrival of a person who had existed until now as a concept rather than a woman standing in the doorway of her recovery room. "He told me it was his personal savings," she said. Her voice was low and careful, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this differently and was now saying it plainly because plainly was what the moment asked for. He said that filing under my real name would give the insurance company a reason to reclassify the procedure and deny the claim. I had been on dialysis for 11 months. I was losing ground. She looked at the window, then back at me. "I was dying, Mrs. Hartley. I believed what I needed to believe." She did not offer it as an excuse. She offered it as a fact, the specific, unambiguous fact of a woman who had understood her situation clearly and made the only choice that felt survivable within it. I walked to the chair beside her bed and sat down. I know he controlled what you knew, I said. That was how he operated. He identified the point where a person was most afraid and built everything he needed directly on top of that. I had said something close to this before to Philip in a different context. It felt different saying it here in this room to the person it had been most true for. You were not the only one. Delaney was quiet for a moment. Something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, but the particular adjustment of someone who has been carrying a version of something alone and has just discovered it had company. 2 weeks before the surgery, she said, I saw a name on a document he left on the desk at his apartment. He had been staying there most nights by then, and I was there with him. She paused. Loretta Ashford. The way it was written, the context around it, didn't match anything he had told me about why his mother was involved. I asked him about it. He explained it away. He was very good at that. Her hands moved slightly against the blanket. But the feeling didn't go away. The sense that something was sitting underneath what I could see. She reached toward the small nightstand beside her bed and opened the drawer. The USB drive was plain black standard, the kind available at any office supply store. She set it on the blanket between us and looked at it for a moment before looking at me. About 3 weeks ago, he fell asleep in the chair in the living room, she said. His laptop was open on the coffee table. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I don't know what I was looking for exactly. A breath. There was a folder called something ordinary estate planning or private files, I can't remember the exact name. Inside were audio files. Recordings. She looked at the USB drive. I didn't listen to them. I was afraid of what was on them, and I think some part of me understood that once I listened, I couldn't pretend I hadn't. So I copied everything in the folder onto this and put it in my bag and never opened it. I kept it because I was more afraid of having nothing than I was of having something I didn't understand. She had been, I thought, protecting herself in the only way available to someone who understood that she was in a situation she could not see the full shape of. Not naivety, not complicity. The specific survival intelligence of a woman who was 33 years old and dying, and trying to hold on to something solid in conditions that had been carefully stripped of anything solid. I picked up the USB drive. I held it for a moment without speaking. Then I looked at Delaney at the IV line, and the pallor and the particular quality of exhausted clarity in her face, and I said the thing that was true. You needed a kidney. I set my hand briefly on the rail of the bed, not touching her, just close. That part was real. It was the most real thing in any of this. And everything Conrad built around it, the structure, the deception, the people he used to make it happen, that was his doing, not yours. I stood. I hope the rest of this is easier than the part that came before. She looked at me for a long moment. I'm sorry, she said. For whatever part of it reached you. I know, I said. I walked out of room 412 and down the corridor to the elevator and through the lobby and out through the automatic doors into the December evening air, which was cold and clear and entirely indifferent to what had happened inside the building. I held the USB drive in my closed hand the entire walk to the parking structure. Philip had told me once during our early meetings when we were still mapping the shape of what Conrad had built, that the most dangerous evidence was always the kind a guilty man kept for himself, the recordings and documents and private records that people maintained not to exonerate themselves, but to control others. The insurance a person took out against the people they had used. I understood walking through the cold air with that small piece of plastic in my hand that Conrad had kept his. My car was on the second level of the parking structure in the same space I had parked it on Tuesday morning when I came to the bank before driving to the hospital. In the same space I had returned to every day since. I had been in and out of that structure so many times over the past several days that I had stopped noticing it as a place and had begun to experience it simply as a threshold, the point of transition between the interior of the building and whatever was outside it. I saw the envelope when I was still 10 feet away. It was tucked under the driver's side windshield wiper, flat against the glass, white against the ambient light of the parking structure. Plain envelope, standard size. My name on the front in a handwriting I recognized immediately, a careful, slightly formal script that belonged to someone who had been taught penmanship in a particular era and had never entirely abandoned it. It was not Conrad's handwriting. I stood beside the car for a moment before I picked it up. Then I got in closed. The door turned on the interior light and opened it. Loretta had written 4 pages in the same careful script on plain white paper that she had folded in thirds, the way people fold letters who learned the habit before email made folding unnecessary. The date at the top was 4 weeks before her hospital admission, 4 weeks before Conrad had called me with a breaking voice to tell me she had collapsed at home. She wrote that she had opposed it. She wrote that Conrad had come to her 6 weeks before that date, 9 weeks before her admission, and explained what he intended to do. He had laid it out the way he laid everything out, methodically, with reasons and structures and an internal logic that made each piece seem like it followed inevitably from the one before it. He needed her cooperation. He needed her to be available for a period of weeks in a hospital room, performing a condition she did not have. In exchange, he would continue to be the son he had been, present, attentive. The person she depended on. She had told him no. She had told him it was wrong. Not strategically wrong, not legally wrong. She had used the word she meant, morally wrong. She had sat across from her son in her kitchen in Franklin and told him that she would not participate in deceiving a woman who had brought her coffee every Sunday for 26 years and treated her with the consistent, undemanding kindness of someone who had chosen to include her without obligation. Conrad had listened to all of it. And then he had said with the same measured calm he brought to everything that if she did not help him, he would move out of his current arrangement entirely and establish himself elsewhere in a way that made ongoing contact between them logistically unlikely. She was 79 years old and lived alone in the house in Franklin where she had raised him. He was her only child. She had chosen to help him. She did not dress it as anything other than what it was. There was no paragraph explaining the fear in terms that made it sound more acceptable. She had been afraid of losing him, and the fear had been stronger than the principle, and she had made a decision she had regretted from the morning she made it. The rest of the letter was not justification. It was inventory. At the bottom of the last page she had written, "Vivienne, you deserved better than my son. I should have told you so years ago, and I told myself I was being diplomatic. And I think now that I was being a coward. I am sorry. I understand that sorry is not enough. I am saying it anyway, because it is the only thing I have left to give." I folded the letter along the same creases it had arrived with. I thought about Donna, who had clearly received this letter from Loretta at some point in the past weeks, with instructions that I understood without needing to have them explained. Place it on her car when the time comes. Donna, who had been threading through this entire situation with the particular care of a person who understood exactly what she was doing and why, and who had done it without calling attention to herself at any point. I would thank her properly later. This was not the moment for it. I sat in the car without starting it. There was no crying. I want to be precise about that. Not because the letter did not move something in me, but because the particular movement it produced was not the kind that arrived as tears. It was quieter than that. A kind of settling the way a building settles after a long disturbance finding its new configuration. I had spent 3 decades with a version of Loretta Ashford that I now understood had always been more complicated than it appeared, and the complication was not what I had imagined. And the truth of it was both worse and more forgivable than the simpler story I might have told. Forgiving someone was not the same as excusing them. I had been clear about that with myself since the beginning of this, and I remained clear about it now. What I felt sitting in that parking structure with a folded letter in my lap was not forgiveness, and it was not its absence. It was something with less clean edges than either of those, the recognition that people made choices under conditions that shaped them, and that the shape of the conditions did not remove the weight of the choice, but it did change what the weight meant. My phone rang. Nora Fenn from her office downtown, where she had apparently spent the afternoon and evening in the kind of sustained productive activity that certain lawyers reserve for days when everything moved at once. "The divorce order has been entered by the court," she said without preamble. "It's final. Asset recovery proceedings will begin. Monday morning, the transfers Conrad executed under fraudulent inducement are all challengeable, and the documentation we have prepared is more than sufficient to initiate that process. You should expect full or near full recovery of the assets." A pause, which was unusual for Nora. "You're going to be fine, Vivienne." "I know," I said. She said goodnight and ended the call. I sat for another few minutes after that. The parking structure was quiet around me. Somewhere several levels below, the investigation that had begun with 2 dark sedans was still proceeding through its procedural stages. Somewhere on the 3rd floor of the building behind me, Loretta Ashford was in a room she had never needed, learning for the first time that the plan her son had asked her to participate in had concluded in the only way it could have. I reached for the ignition. My phone vibrated once against the console. "Philip." A single line of text. "Before you go home, check what's on that USB tonight." I looked at the message. Then I looked at the USB drive sitting in the cup holder where I had set it when I got in the car, in the same spot where I sometimes set my coffee in the mornings, in the small domestic groove of a daily life that I was in the process of reconstructing from different materials than the ones I had started with. I picked it up. I looked at it for a moment in the interior light. Then I started the car and drove home. The kitchen light at the house in Brentwood was the only light on in the neighborhood that I could see from the window, which probably said something about the hour and something about the kind of people who lived on that street who had the good sense to be in bed by 9:30 on a Thursday in December. I had driven home in the way I drove, when I did not want to think mechanically, following the familiar sequence of turns without processing them, letting the muscle memory of 19 years of the same route carry me from the parking structure at Vanderbilt to the driveway of a house that was technically no longer mine and practically still felt like it, because legal instruments move faster than the body's sense of place. I set the USB drive on the kitchen table. I opened my laptop. I plugged it in. The drive contained 47 audio files, organized in a single folder with a name Conrad had chosen for its neutrality: administrative records, with a date stamp from 18 months ago. 47 files ranging in length from 4 minutes to 42, spanning a period of approximately 6 weeks. Delaney had copied all of them on a night when Conrad fell asleep in a living room chair, out of an instinct for self-preservation that she had not fully understood at the time, and that had turned out in ways she did not yet know to be the most consequential thing she had done across the entire preceding year. I opened the first file. Conrad's voice was clear and unambiguous, the same measured professional cadence I had heard for 3 decades across dinner tables and courtroom anecdotes, and the small exchanges of daily life. He was speaking to Loretta. He was explaining with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to any complex arrangement exactly what each step of the plan required from her, what the timing looked like, and what he expected in exchange for his continued presence in her life. I listened to the first file, then the second, then 3 more. By the 5th, I had enough. There was no ambiguity in any of it. No interpretation required no context that could alter the meaning of what was said. Conrad had made these recordings not to document wrongdoing, but to ensure that Loretta could not later claim ignorance or coercion in a direction that didn't serve his interests, the insurance a man takes out when he has recruited an unwilling participant and wants to retain leverage over her indefinitely. He had built a record against his own mother in his own voice, describing his own actions. I composed an email to Nora Fenn at 10 o'clock. I attached the drive's contents and wrote 4 sentences explaining what the files were and where they had come from. I pressed send. Nora, who appeared to keep hours that suggested either extraordinary dedication or a complete indifference to sleep, replied within 12 minutes. Received. Forwarding to the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI case team tonight. This completes the evidentiary record. I closed the laptop and sat in the kitchen until the clock moved past 11. By the following morning, the picture had taken its final shape. Conrad faced 3 federal charges, with the evidentiary record now complete enough that the prosecutorial path had become considerably less complicated than it might have been without the audio files. His attorney, not Marcus, not anyone from Ashford and Weld, but a criminal defense lawyer from a firm in Memphis that handled federal matters, had advised him, according to what Philip relayed to me, to expect a process measured in months rather than weeks. Loretta was in a conference room at the federal building downtown, with an appointed attorney beside her, answering questions she had understood from the moment her accounts were frozen, were inevitable. The letter she had written had been a private reckoning. What she was doing now was a legal one. I did not know what she would say, and I found sitting with that thought that I did not particularly need to know. Marcus Weld had already filed the paperwork to dissolve Ashford and Weld LLP and reconstitute the practice under a new name that carried only the names of the remaining partners. 24 years of professional identity reorganized overnight into something that could continue without the weight of what Conrad had attached to it. I thought Marcus had moved quickly, and I thought that said something about the kind of clarity that certain kinds of endings produced. Delaney Frost was in room 412, beginning the slow, careful process of recovery that follows a major transplant surgery, the medications, the monitoring, the gradual return of ordinary physical function. She did not know about the USB drive. She did not know what the files on it had produced, or what had happened in the lobby of the building below her room the previous afternoon. She had a new kidney and the beginning of a future she had not been certain she would have, and those 2 things were, I thought, enough for a person to be carrying at one time. I drove to Vanderbilt that morning. I did not go inside. I parked on the 2nd level of the structure, the same space, the same ambient light, and I sat in the car for a minute looking at the entrance to the building through the windshield. Then I got out and walked to the sidewalk near the main doors, where a municipal trash receptacle stood beside a concrete planter that held a small evergreen someone had wrapped in white lights for the season. I reached into my bag and found the envelope Conrad had handed me in the lobby the previous afternoon. I took out the divorce papers, the pages I had signed without hesitation, the document that had been at the moment of signing the activation of everything that followed. I held them for a moment. Then I tore them in half, and tore them in half again, and placed the pieces in the trash receptacle with the same care I had used when I set 2 cups of coffee on a hallway shelf 2 days before. The papers were already legally irrelevant. The divorce had been entered by the court and was final regardless of what I did with the physical documents. The tearing was not a legal act. It was a private one. The difference between those 2 things had mattered to me for a long time, and it continued to matter. I walked back to my car. I sat for another moment looking at the building. Then I drove away and did not go back. I lost a house I had lived in for 19 years. I lost a marriage I had believed in for 31. I lost a version of myself, the one who signed things without reading them a second time, who trusted across a line that good sense would have drawn differently, who had confused the duration of a relationship with the reliability of the person inside it. What I kept is harder to name. It was not the money, though the money came back. It was not the verdict, though, that came too in its own time and through its own processes. It was something quieter than either of those things, the knowledge that when the moment arrived, when everything I had built was being removed from me, one notarized signature at a time, I did not panic. I did not beg. I did not become unrecognizable to myself. I did what I had always done when something required doing. I assessed the situation clearly. I identified what was available to me, and I worked with what was in front of me until what was in front of me changed. There is a version of this story in which I am the victim. I choose not to tell it that way. Saving her life was the most expensive thing I ever did. Saving mine costs nothing at all. I've read that God doesn't give a person more than they can carry. I used to call that comfort. I call it a challenge now. This family drama story didn't begin with a betrayal. It began with a signature mine on papers I trusted without reading. If you take one thing from this family revenge story, take this. Know what belongs to you before someone else decides. Read what you sign. Pay attention to the numbers. Don't wait for the crisis to become the person the crisis needs. These family drama stories happen in quiet houses, long marriages, ordinary Tuesdays. And these family revenge stories, the ones worth telling, are never about rage. They are about patience, precision, and refusing to become only a victim of your own life. That is my belief. You may disagree. This has been a family drama story worth telling. I hope it stayed with you. If it did, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because the next story is already waiting. Thank you for staying until the very end. Coming stories contain fictional elements built for reflection and education. If that's not for you, no judgment. Find what serves you.
And that's how everything settled at the end. I'm glad you were here. See you next time.